Good day. My name is Tony Ballinger from the Fighting Men of Rhodesia YouTube series. And my guest today, who I'm very excited to speak to, is Captain Vince McCabe from the Rhodesian and the Zimbabwean Army. And in fact, he had a bit of exposure to the Brits as well. Having read his synopsis, I think it's going to be a wonderful talk. So, Vince, welcome to the show. And how are you feeling over there in Ireland at the moment?
Thanks very much, Tony. First of all, thank you so much for all that you've done for Fighting Men of Rhodesia. Just having this history is something incredible. I think it's the next generation that are really going to benefit from that. So thanks so much to you and to the many others who've done this. Ireland's, we're having a great time in Ireland. The last couple of days have been pretty good weather, which is amazing for March. Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, and I think all the Irish really have a good drink up on Paddy's Day. So it should be fun.
Excellent. And the usual format is, which is hard to get away from, is give us your background, where you were born, raised, and how you actually ended up in the army.
Yeah, sure, Tim. So I was born on Valentine's Day, 1957, in Glasgow, Scotland. My father was an electrical engineer, one of the youngest ever to get his electrical engineering ticket in Scotland. My mother was Irish. She was from Donegal, and they immigrated to Scotland during the potato farm, actually, potato famine, when things went south in Ireland. I re-immigrated to South Africa in 1964. I think as a Catholic family living in Glasgow, I think my parents got sick of the Protestant guys throwing stones at us on a Friday, so I think that was it. So we spent a little bit of time in South Africa, 64, and then my dad went onto the mines in Mukalera in Zambia in 65. A little bit of a funny story there. I attended quite a brutal Catholic school there. It was full of nuns. And I had the most terrible handwriting. And I can remember them saying, right, Vincent, get up, take your books, walk down all the desks, and let everybody look at your work. And these kids used to snigger at me. And then I'd go off to Mother Superior who gave me a cane. Well, I can tell you, Tony, that only lasted about 3 months. And then they'd take me off and give me some writing lessons. And after that, I had the most beautiful handwriting in the world. But they were pretty brutal.
Oh, good for them. Yeah. So what happened after that?
Well, then we 1966 we went back to Scotland for a short while, and then my dad immigrated, took the family, myself, my brother, my sister, and my mum to Rhodesia. I attended Eastridge School from May. I think we arrived in Rhodesia May 68, and I was in Eastridge from May to December. And then for 69, I went to Alfredite Junior School. Thereafter, just for 2 short terms, I went to Ellis Robbins. And then I ended up at Cranbourne Boys High School in Salisbury for the rest of my education up until 75. My dad left us in 69. And the saddest thing was he became quite a heavy drinker, gambler. And in fact, he was deported out of Rhodesia. The only reason we stayed, we were allowed to stay, is my late brother Danny, and I'll talk about a little bit later. He was just joined in the Union Air Force. I stood guarantor for my mum and I, and actually got us to stay in Rhodesia. And my hats off to him. So and then, like all Rhodesian boys, I played a lot of sport, Tony. So I think I just mentioned earlier to you, the wonderful thing about our Rhodesian schools is we've got so much leadership at such an early age. I can remember being in Form 1, I actually captained the first team baseball team. Interesting story, myself and Bruce Strobler, who was a Liverpool goalkeeper, we were best of friends. We played baseball together at Relton Sports Club. And Ray Morse, who was a great rugby player, great Springbok, he was with Greendale, I think it was. Bruce and I also played football for Salisbury Callies Football Club. 1973, we actually played in the under-16 Castle Cup final, which we won, in front of 50,000 spectators who were there to watch the main event. But it was incredible to play in that. And I think you just think of some of those sports when they came out of incredible. And I played lots of sport. I was first team cricket, first team hockey. I became a full prefect, etc. And did my M levels in 75. And the reason I got to the officers course, it was simple. I remember very clearly sitting in a final exam. I think it was pure maths. I think the pure applied maths. And the teacher came down and was handing out these letters. It was addressed to Mr. McCabe. Like, wow, where's this one? And I opened it, and it was from General Peter Walls. And it said, consider going on officer selection board. And I looked at the bottom of the letter, and it was signed in color. And I thought, wow, this is addressed to me personally. I think it was the first of the auto pens, Tony.
Yeah.
But it said, think about officer selection board. I thought, wow, I went straight down to the recruiting officer's office. And in fact, I think you might have known Alf Logan was down there as the recruiting officer. And I remember just going, as I walked next to his office, there was that beautiful army recruiting poster. You'll remember the one that said, be a man amongst men. And I sat down and Alf said to me, just remember something. If you get on officer school and you pass, you could be 26 and be a major. And I tell you, Tony, I was completely sold. And in the January 76, I started officer selection course.
I mean, that type of wording is brilliant psychological warfare, because it appeals to that inner youth, the man that's about to be a man. This is exciting stuff, man alive.
It was great. It was absolutely great. And so, but I think when I was putting this synopsis together, one of the other things that I downloaded from my school, and this would have been much bigger for you, Tony, being at a large school in like Churchill. But I go back and I look at the school, the Campbell Boys High School, the Roll of Honor, and I look at guys like Nick Smith, Lieutenant Nick Smith, killed in '67. Charles Viljoen, who was at Campbell Boys, who drowned in the Zambezi in '68, and so many others. We only had a very small school of 300, but so many people, were the men of men and also gave their lives for the country. Quite something.
Yes, it's tragic that happened. But I think we did what was right. We wanted to maintain law and order and keep our beautiful country running. So I personally will never believe that they died for nothing. Some people feel like that, but no, I think, war's not an nice thing, but
I think you're absolutely right. And it was an incredible period. And I don't think we'll ever have a Rhodesia. We'll never be able to have another Rhodesia like that. It was I just look at the kids growing up. I look at every one of the schools. And when we talk a little later about the book, I look at some of the incredible sportsmen, the incredible talents that we had in such a small country. It was absolutely amazing. When you think of the guys that did do their service, it didn't matter whether it was national service or whether it was regulars. They fought, and the Rhodesian African Rifles often said about the RLI was, they had faces of boys but hearts of lions. And that's just the way I think Rhodesians were.
Yeah, a wonderful spirit. So you've left school and you went straight into the army, or did you have a job in between?
Just for the month of December, I actually went to the post and telecommunications for the December break. My mum worked there, and then I went straight on the first of the officer selection board. And, I think it was 8th of January 1976. Yeah, and that was the course that.
Tell us a bit about that selection process. It's
Sure.
both psychological and physical, isn't it?
It is, Cody. I think I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the book side of it a bit more. But I think what I wanted to say about that first officer selection course was it was a very mature course. I failed the first one. I actually spent 6 months on my first officer selection board. I think about 120 or so started on the officer selection board, go through that week. 28 was selected, I think 10 were commissioned. And I think you would know people like Brigadier Pat Wallace, who was on that course, Vernon Prinsloo, Richmond Molson, etc. But I do think, I think I was the youngest by a bit on that course. And I do think often when you fail something, it's a terrible feeling when you fail. But I think the sense of failure is something that somebody has to have. Can't always be successful. I think, wow, I spent 6 months in a course. I think of poor old Pat Wallace. He spent 16.5 months on his Air Force course in 6 weeks before commission. They kicked him off. He came to the army and he got the Sword of Honor and the Sun Army. If you look at the caliber of that man, becoming a brigadier in somebody else's army, I think it tells you what what a hard selection, and just becoming an officer in the army was.
You seem to have bounced back because you got an award.
Oh, well, I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to be so naive twice, Tony. So when I came back on my second course, I came top of the course academically. I got the Army Commander's Award. But just that 6 months of being away, I just thought was great. When I was called in and told that I was going to be kicked off the course, George Lambert Porter was the course officer, and it was very simple. He said to me, "You don't have to come back and do another officer selection. You just need 6 months of maturity. Go to the RLI, go and spend 6 months, and just come straight back on the course, and I'm sure you'll do well." And it was fantastic. So I just took that 6 months and I prepared like mad, and made sure that that I worked hard, and I really did. I had no bridges. There was nothing behind me. I had very little family. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice.
So did you go to the RLI, or was that study outside of the army?
No, I went to the RLI. So I went. It was a simple case as well, Tony. I wasn't, I can't remember who said it to me. It might have been, I think I might have asked Hockey Binks. I said, "Well, so if I join RLI as a national serviceman, how much do I get?" And he said, "You'll get $45. And I said, "Well, what if I join as a regular?" "Oh, you'll get $250. I thought, stuff that. I'm going to the RLI as a troopie. So I spent 6 months there, from June to December, and then came back on the next officer's course. So I served with one commander. I was in 5 troop. Did an external in Mozambique in September 76 as well. And
sorry, which external was that, Vince?
I can't remember the name of it. In fact, it was the one where we had one youngster killed, in Graham Tanner, I think his name was. We got completely lost. We had the SAS ourselves, Salute Scouts. We got totally lost going into Mozambique. And the thing that I remember was us running out of water, and then sending in the islanders, those little islander planes in to drop water to us in 20-liter silver cans, to keep us going for a couple of days before we marched out. I don't think we killed any tours at all. It wasn't a great operation.
It was a horrible place for water.
Whoa, it wasn't the best.
We all collectively agreed to drink our drips on one occasion, and I'm not sure whether the saltiness of it made the thirst worse, but it beefed us up a bit.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So tell us about your course. It was a very hard course. It lasted 13 months. Tell us that you had 3 or 4 stages, I believe, if you could walk us through those.
Yeah, sure, Tony. So it was a 54-week course. And just to go back to that officer selection board that you were talking about. So on the one that, the second one, I had the stats because later on I was at the School of Infantry. So there were 760 people that actually applied to come on the officer selection board throughout the world. 156 actually made the officer selection board that week of selection. And essentially what was, we had I think it was, I didn't attend, but I think if you asked Hamish, I think his dad was actually the in charge of that as a brigadier. There were a number of colonels and majors, and essentially you were put through a range of stuff from IQ tests, psychological tests, night exercises, day exercises. But it was a wonderful time, Tony, because the officers treated you beautifully. And everyone was thinking, wow, we get treated like this, we got drinks and mess and evenings and stuff like that. It's going to be fantastic. Right. I'll talk to you a little bit about that just now. So of that 156, 44 was selected to start the course. And essentially it's broken into 4 phases. First phase is 16 weeks. And that really is the brutal phase where you're subjected to, I would say if we were getting more than 4 hours sleep a night, it was a lot. So it's subjected to a lot of physical work, arms training at the same time, lectures, and then weekly progress tests. And the dropout rate in that first phase was very, very phenomenal. And what I learned very quickly is that it doesn't matter how big you are. It's got really nothing to do with how strong and how big you are. You have to dig psychologically deep during that first phase to get through it. And at the end of the first phase, there is a 10-day, what's known as an escape and evasion exercise, where that whole 16 weeks is put into a sort of exercise where you're broken into 4-man sticks. I had Captain Bruce Willis as my directing staff, and they put you through, you're carrying about 40 kilos, 40, 50 kilos on your back, you're doing 60 kilometers per day, and you've got a whole series of exercises to do. And the culmination is being captured and interrogated for 24 hours. So waterboarded, quite dramatic actually. And that really broke a number of people down. So at the end of that phase, I think you come out of that, they give you a final debrief, and you go on a 10-day break. And we ended up with 22 people at the end of that phase. So that was basically 50% of the course that was gone. And the next phase was 16 weeks. And that was classical war phase. And a lot of Rhodesians say, why did you guys bother with classical war when you were fighting counterinsurgency? But it was an incredible way to learn the principles of war. Digging trenches, understanding how companies, platoons, battalions, brigades worked, doing 12 model exercises. And I think that's where more of the academic pressure was starting to be applied. So you had the weekly progress tests, you had different exercises from fighting in built-up areas to bush exercises, to working with the Air Force.
And it was an essential phase, Vince, because just as our war was ending, we were actually entering that conventional phase. So the training would have come in very handy if it had progressed.
Indeed, when you were doing external ops as well, it was quite handy digging shell scraps and stuff like that. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was great. And I think what it taught us as well, I think one has to remember, when you're doing a 13-month course training, what they're teaching you is training you to be a general. And at the end of the day, 30 years later, you're expected to be a commander of the army. And you might be having to lead 3 or 4 brigades and put that all together in conventional warfare. It might be external, not only be in the So, and to learn the old historical campaigns, we learned the Italian campaign of the Second World War with Montgomery and guys basically running through Italy, and it's fascinating to learn how they cornered the Germans and how they defeated the Germans. And sometimes people were saying maybe Churchill was wrong. We should just have gone straight through North Africa and then bang straight into Europe. But it was fascinating to understand how a whole classical operation and what they called the campaigns worked. So that was great fun.
Yeah. And then you did the coin phase, I think, after that.
So we had another 10-day break, and just before that we had our mid-year exams, to the 4 3R exam, and that basically was the first checkpoint for the academic placing of the cadets. And then we went on a nice 10-day break and then came back for the counterinsurgency phase. But the first thing that we did before that was, as regular cadets, each course used to go down to South Africa to go and see how the South Africans ran their operations, and that was fascinating. I mean, when you read the book, Mike Wilson, who was our course officer, talks about the enormity and the size of the South African operations compared to the Rhodesian operations. So we traveled down in an army bus, and in our civilian clothes, we were allowed to wear our Rhodesian kits. And we visited both Army and Air Force operations. And it was interesting to see that some of our Rhodesians down there, so some of our pilots were down there training on Mirage 3s and Mirage, I think the Mirage F1s as well, if I'm not mistaken. I know certainly when we turned up at Rhodesia, Poppy Benico was there. What I haven't ever discovered is what was the purpose of that, whether we were going to get Mirage 3s or whether South Africa had worked out that maybe at some point in time people would be coming down there.
I think when Filed airfield was built, that was designated for the Mirages, I believe, because as versatile and as wonderful as the Hunters were, if we were going to start fighting MiG-23s and that type of thing, wouldn't have coped. I don't think, I'm not an expert, but I believe that's where they were going to be based.
Right. Yeah. Well, I found that the whole South African tour was fascinating. At that stage, I think 77. The rifles had just come out, and it was a big deal to see the rifles with their weapons. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was 50 mil on the rifle.
The 90 mil. They had a 90 mil, same as the Eland. In fact, it was taken off an Eland. I've interviewed all of these South African generals and all that were involved in that type of thing. And going back to the size of everything in South Africa, when I interviewed Roland de Vries, Major General, I said, you guys could have called up 600,000 men, could did you have helmets, boots, rifles, and everything for 600,000 men and transport? And he said, yes. So, it was about 40 times bigger than what we could do.
Well, if you think Tony of our army, it literally was the black forces that was the majority of our army are Rhodesian African rifle units. I mean, I think we could probably pull up 10,000 white people if we were lucky. But it wasn't the amount of people who pulled out. I think it was the caliber of the Rhodesians that was something special.
Our manpower pool was 69,000.
Yeah.
And if you think that people were being rotated, it probably meant there wasn't 69,000 is 4 divisions of men. But if you've got some in and some out, we probably had, I don't know, 8, 9, 10,000 at the most.
Yep.
In the field.
Yeah, and fighting external operations as well. And that was the caliber of the men that we had. It was something incredible.
But a real stalwart to the whole thing, as I've learned through these fascinating interviews, was people like internal affairs and guard force, because they were like the flesh on the bone, the RLI and all these guys with the bones out there hammering, but that flesh that held everything together and got local rules and regulations enforced and cattle dipped and places guarded. I mean, guard force had 7,000 men. I think internal affairs had a similar number. So they were milling around, keeping the country safe to the best of their ability, while the army and everybody else did their own thing.
Very much so. And I think they were sort of almost underreported in the importance of what they did for the country as well. They really were quite something special. So yeah, just going back to the South African tour, one of the great things that I thoroughly enjoyed was going to a place called Silver Mine, which was deep underground near Cape Town, where a lot of the naval operations were held. And it was just incredible to see the level of sophistication that those guys had. And I have to say, the South Africans looked after us for that 2 weeks. So once we finished in South Africa, we then came back and really started the counterinsurgency operations, tracking forces, learning how to do a lot of external operations in terms of theory, and working with the Air Force and other units. So I think that was probably the most interesting part of the course. And I think we had a few guys that had previous military experience. So for them, it was a lot easier than some of the guys who came out of school. And that period lasted 16 weeks as well, which was over 4 months. And then culminating in the final examinations, again, 3-4 hour examinations, and then off for a break of 10 days. And then we came back for the final 6 weeks of the course, which was essentially getting ready for commissioning.
Wow, that's quite something. And that 6 weeks must have been a moment of incredible pride and excitement for the guys that had got through.
It was. I mean, our final thing was going and visiting the units around Rhodesia, and the Air Force took us down to Buffalo Range and Mentali and elsewhere. And all we were waiting for was where are we all going to get commissioned? So we did a sort of final pulling exercise. I came back to School of Infantry, and then we were told to all get into the officer cadets mess. I'll never forget, it was a Saturday evening, and then the commissions were announced and what unit people were going to. I think for some it was an elation. I think for the guys who got their spots, because not everyone got the unit that they wanted to go to. It was great. Some guys were disappointed, but it was quite something. And then, very soon after that, the various regiments came. So RLI, RAR signals brought troops up to come and participate in the final parade. And we had 2 weeks of marching up and down and making sure that we all looked great for the final commissioning parade. So it was something. It was a tremendous moment, I think, for everybody. We had. I think it was Hannes, I think, interviewed Graham Trask, got the Silver Cross. And, Graham's parents came all the way out from New Zealand. Graham volunteered for the Rhodesian Army. So what a proud moment for his parents to come out. And I remember Ian Smith thanking him for volunteering to come to the army. So yeah, it was really great. And the commissioning ball was the evening commissioning ball lasted right to the next morning. For those of us who could stay awake.
And what was your reaction to the unit you were allocated to?
Well, I came top of the course, so I had my choice. Except, I suppose when I say I had my choice, what was very interesting was I was called in by Mike Wilson and told that I shouldn't put down 1 or 2 RAR. I should just mainly put down RAR, and I thought nothing of it. So my choices were RAR, RLI, and Rhodesian Armored Car Regiment. And when it was announced 2 RAR, to be very honest, I hadn't given it much thought. Oh my goodness. I think I was slightly disappointed because I always wanted to go to the main regiment. But what a blessing. It was the most wonderful of regiments, and I don't think I could have gone to a better place and served with some of the great officers that I did. So for me, it was a case of getting my head down. Thank goodness I got commissioned, and I had somewhere to go.
And I see you wearing the very proud tie of the RAR there.
I am.
And why did you want to go to an African battalion or regiment rather than a European one?
Tony, that's a good question. I think for me, it was more about wanting to work in the bush with if you like, people who come from different tribes to understand what was really happening in Rhodesia, and to get to understand them a bit more rather than maybe just serving in Fire Force and doing that part of the work. And I think it was just wonderful. My troops were incredibly loyal. I never once did I ever in a contact ever find myself in a situation where I thought, geez, I'm a bit worried here. The troops aren't with me. In some ways, they were just very aggressive. But it was wonderful. Some of the things that you would do is you'd go, you would come back for R&R. And as an officer, you'd go on inspections to the barracks, and you'd meet their families, and you'd get to the bottom ground of the apartments to go and do an inspection. By the time you got to the 3rd floor, maybe it would be an hour and a half later, I was completely drunk most of the time. And you'd have these fantastic stories, because RAR also made sure that those soldiers who were still alive and who might have served in the Second World War or who had retired were also in the barracks. Sitting and listening to some of their stories was absolutely phenomenal. I had the wonderful opportunity as well, Tony. My wife is Burmese, and I had a wonderful opportunity to go to Burma and go and see the war graves of the troops that were killed during the Second World War. And Burma has kept the graves are in beautiful condition. But if you look at how many troops from Rhodesia and from the colonies that were killed in the Second World War, it was frightening. And so I think there was all the history that I so love.
In fact, the Rhodesian army lost more men per head of population than any other Commonwealth country.
They did.
And the only people who beat us, I think, were the Russians.
Yeah, per capita, we certainly did. And what was very interesting as well is to look back and see that how many Indian troops, in the old days, there was no Pakistan. So the Indian troops and the Muslim troops were all fighting together for the motherland. To see their names up there, and the Australians and the Brits and the Rhodesians and the Kenyans and the Zambians that were all killed, it was frightening. The horror of war, when you look at it conventionally, is something to behold.
Mm-hmm. So, can we go forward from there to your first posting and perhaps your first deployments there?
Sure. Do you also want me to talk a little bit about my late brother as well, Tony, or do you want to do that?
Oh, yes, please. Anything that was in your synopsis is very well worth listening to, please.
Yeah, I thought we could just take a break and just talk about my late brother. I mentioned him earlier about how lucky we were that he joined the Rhodesian Air Force in 1969. He joined as another rank. And my brother had left school at 15, in Scotland. During those times, there was very little time to have an education. So, but he was an exceptionally good soccer player, and I think that's why he got into the Rhodesian Air Force. But he worked his way up he went into the equipment branch and worked his way up to get his commission. He actually was commissioned in late 79 into the equipment branch. And I think he was a warrant officer class 2 at 26. Some of the interesting stories about Danny was he was part of the team that procured the cheetahs for us, the Augusta Bell 205s that we got towards the last part of the war. And he visited France on a number of occasions to secure spare parts for our Alouettes, and also was doing some sanctions busting for the hunters and a couple of other things. And the reason why I mentioned that is that I know that there's been a lot of interviews for the pilots of the Region Air Force, our wonderful pilots and our chopper techs. But I'd encourage those guys who are in the equipment branch, who may have been senior to my brother, to have a talk, because without those guys, without the sanctions busting that those guys came up with, I don't think we could have kept that Air Force running. It just wouldn't have been able to run. So I'm quite fascinated by that. He also became a karate expert and with his MBA. But I've sent you a couple of photographs of him. I think the one that you've got, you might be showing later, was where he was doing his flight lieutenant's course. There were a number of pilots on that course as well. And I think there's one in his dining room kit. So we encourage those guys who are in the Rhodesian Air Force, or might have been in the equipment branch, to do come to I think they've got fascinating stories.
Yeah, that would certainly be very, very welcome. Yeah, please, if you could badger them a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Oh, great stuff. Yeah, so going on to my first posting. So we were commissioned on the 10th of February, 78. We got a quick 10-day break, and then I joined D Company 2 RAR in Port Victoria. And my first year he was actually an ex-RLI officer, Colonel John McVeigh. He would later become Commander of Special Forces, which I'll talk a little bit about later. I hit it straight off with Colonel McVeigh. He almost became like a father to me. And he loved soccer, football. And I happened to play good soccer. And I remember him saying to me, right, you're going to captain the side. We're going to go down and win the cup against Bala Bala and one area down in Bulawayo. It didn't quite work out like that. I don't think he had a particularly good relationship with the CEO of one area, who was Colonel Shute at the time, but maybe we can talk a bit later. But as a second lieutenant, I got caught in a little bit of an argument between two colonels, which was quite something. Anyway, so yeah, and what was really good, I think, when I first joined the battalion, so with me was Graham Trass, Mike Noble, Karen Stewart, and myself, of course, down at 2RAR. And the great thing was they prepared for us a whole subalterns group, which was fantastic to get to a battalion and be able to learn from other officers about what the regiment was all about. It was absolutely fantastic. So that was really good. And what they taught us was the do's and don'ts of being a young officer. Because some of these things, like you wouldn't believe it, but just saluting another officer's wife was an important thing in the RAR. You wouldn't think about it, but that was taught to us, and how to have really good etiquette, not do stupid things. But it's second lieutenant's a lot. So straight after Subalterns Week, I went on deployment. In fact, what was interesting is we were deployed to Lupani the first time, and that's really in Zipper country more than it was in Yazanga country, where I was used to. And I found that it was fast education, it was hard going, patrolling, nothing much happened. But after R&R, I started my first fire force. So April sort of 78 was my first fire force operation. That was out of fire force, what we call Charlie in Lutenga. And that was my first operation. I think what was interesting about that operation, I can clearly remember it, was being pulled out early in the morning with 10 tours. Graham Trass actually was actually on patrol. He managed to put a stop group at One River Line. I think we killed 4 in that contact and captured 2. That was the first time I really saw these aggressive, loyal RAR troops under fire, and nobody was going backwards. In fact, right at the beginning, they looked to be more aggressive than the officers. They really were the top troops. So it was.
So how did the men take to you? Did they show respect straight away, or did you have to earn it? Or...
No, you have to earn it, Tony. I think it's like any of the units. They'll be there for you, but you have to earn it. If you don't show good leadership, then I think your troops will pretty lose confidence, and But I think the 13-month officers course taught us that you had to be a good leader, that you had to be aggressive, and more so you had to have the interests of your troops at heart. I mean, one of the simple things that maybe people tend to forget, what was drummed into us, we were talking about running out of water. You never asked anybody else for water. That was just a no-no. And when you did get to water, your troops always ran first. And I can remember getting my troops lost. I got us lost in the Ghana Reserve. And we were out of water for 24 hours. And I remember when we found an old cattle that, and, you'll drink anything and you have that water. And waiting for 45 minutes for my troops to fill their water bottle, you just had to wait. Yeah, you had to earn their respect. But I think it came quickly if you showed the right sort of resolve, and they became intensely loyal. That's what I found about my IRA soldiers, and they looked after your back all the time.
They were marvelous troops, really. I served with them for a while. Just incredible guys.
Yep. Yeah. So I had I think you were talking about my synopsis. I had to give you a sort of checkpoint. May 78, I was just come off Fire Force, and I was sitting in company base camp, and I get this signal comes out that says, "You're off to go and do your regimental signal officer school." Well, I was a signal lieutenant. You have to go on captain's courses. But apparently, John McVeigh had asked me specifically wanted me to go on that course. So I hopped on a vehicle a day later, arrived at the battalion headquarters, only to be told that John had been promoted to colonel and posted, and I wasn't going anywhere near a signals officer's course. I was going on para course, which was great. So I headed off to do my para course with Graham Trass and Chris Vincent from 2RAR, and my company commander at the time was Brian McDermott. So we headed off in May. One of the interesting things I remember was very first time driving past the RLI barracks to see. You'll remember Andre Skiepers. He was on my course, and he got quite badly injured. And we looked up, and there was Andre running, trying to get fit, trying to get himself back into battle fitness after being injured so badly. It was one of the sort of first things on our way to New Serum to go and start our course, I can remember. So that was quite interesting. We and straight off the para course, then back on Fire Force.
And all of your guys were para-trained at that point, were they?
Oh yeah, everybody was para-trained. Everyone was para-trained.
And were the majority of your Fire Force deployments by Dakota or Alouette?
Both. So I generally, you would have served in Fire Force operations. So generally, you had 3 or 4 Alouettes and one in DAC, and you'd rotate through that. So sometimes I'd be stopped one the next day, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the combined Fire Force. I'd be in the first out the door in the DAC. So both.
Speak us through that very first deployment in the Dakota, and you've got these guys, you're their leader, there's all hell going on down below. What went through your mind? Were you just so overwhelmed by everything that you just operated out of training, or what happened there, Vince?
Well, Tony, I'll give you the wonderful, funny story of that one. I can remember so clearly standing in the door looking down. In those days, we were jumping out at 500 feet. So essentially, between 20 and 22 seconds between that parachute opening, those good old Saviak Mark 1s, the non-steerable parachutes hitting the ground. And I looked down, and I'm thinking, wow, that's beautiful. What a lovely, clear landing zone that is down there. And I went out the door beautifully, looked up, checked my canopy, everything's going well, mixing. Thought, it's a bloody tree coming in the way. And this true as goodness, I landed in the only tree at the top of the tree in the DZ. And I'll never forget up there. And at the bottom, there's my platoon warrant officer, and I can hear the K-car commander calling, "Where is Sunray? Where is Sunray?" And I hear this African voice saying, "He is up in the tree, over." So it took a little bit of time to get us down, and then the adrenaline kicks in, Tony. You're off and running. And I often have said to people that when you're 20 years old and just turning 21, you never think you're going to be killed. You always think you're battle-proof and you're bulletproof and everything is great until you start to see your first casualty, and then you realize that the war's really on.
Can you describe your advance to contact in an extended line moving towards the target?
Sure. From a paratroop point of view, remember?
Yeah, paratroop. Yeah.
You get 16 guys out the door, and the way that we operated, you would tend to find that the sticks would break up because there might be 3 or 4 different river lines that you'd have to go down. So you wouldn't be an extended line of 16 people generally. What you generally find is that you might have 4 or 8 people in one river line and 4 or 8 in another river line, and then into extended line. And down in the Rutenga sort of area, the bush was very thick. The language here was particularly thick. So what you'd find is there would be no such thing sometimes as extended line. You might lose some of your troops 5 meters or 3 meters away from you because the bush was so thick, and it was quite hard sometimes to keep control going. But I think that was what the advantage of that sometimes was the aggressiveness of the RAR soldier. So that you could find a soldier that might actually be all by himself for a very short period of time that would carry on the fight, while the others would be catching up with him.
That's amazing. So surely control is really important there, because if guys get ahead of you, you could get hit by your own bullets and that type of thing. How did you maintain control in thick bush like that?
Well, we try to keep people as close together as possible, but there were times where you might find that somebody is actually in a river line, you're at the top of a river line, and you can't see him. And if I think of some of those deep river lines that we were in, you might lose a troop for a minute or two. But you've got to make sure that your signals are good. And sometimes, people say, did you shout? Did you scream and shout at troops? You damn well did, because sometimes they did get in front of you, or sometimes they did go missing for a short while as they were going through some heavy bush. So I think we were in some cases quite lucky that we didn't lose more people than we did, because war can be quite chaotic. People think that you can have a nice easy extended line and things are fine, but in the fog of war, when you've got SKS rounds coming over your head, you've got AK rounds, people are throwing grenades at you. Sometimes you might be trying to clear a cave. It can be rather chaotic.
So as you're advancing, is it a case of double tap at likely hiding places, or the machine gunner flattening a certain area, as you going forward like that?
We tended to double tap. There was very little of people just shooting rounds off. And our MAG gunners, I think the RAR MAG gunners were particularly good. They could lay down some fairly good fire very quickly. I never found, Tony, in many of the contexts that I was in, that we ever ran out of ammunition, or I found that the troops were expending too much ammunition. I think we were just so well trained, and the double tap was the answer to killing most of us.
Now, this is a phrase that might be strange to some of our foreign viewers, the double tap. In the Rhodesian army, we didn't advance with our eye looking through the scope like you often see in the movies. We held it in front of us, and the rifle in front of us, and basically, if we saw something move or we suspected something, it was rifle up and double tap into that area. And it actually worked out beautifully. It was very accurate.
It was indeed. The FN rifle, it was just a wonderful piece of equipment. And if you got hit by that anywhere, you were going down. I mean, with an AK, AK is quite a different round. It's a short 7.62. That the long 7.62 of the FN was quite something. But I can remember being in one contact, and I looked up. I think the turn must have been maybe, I don't know, 400 or 500 meters from me. And I was trying to double tap him from there, and I could just see dust popping all over the place. I didn't get anywhere near him, but the double tap kept sort of clicking in.
Yeah, 19 tons per square inch it hits you with.
Yeah, you'd be hit by those, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I know in your synopsis, I don't know if this is too premature to talk about this, but the guys, the audience do like to talk about context, let's be honest. You were in contacts for 42 days in a row at one point. Is that right, Vince?
Yeah, that's right. But just before I do that, I wanted to give you a funny story just before we go into that one, because that was going into that 40 days out of 42. I remember being at Fire Force Rutenga and getting a call out from a 4 aircraft, East Reserve Air Wing. And they said they'd spotted some line in the Ghana River, and we flew down there. The most funniest thing I've ever seen. I had 2 sticks getting on the ground. We're going down this river line, and I look up and I see this massive baobab tree. And I'm thinking, something's moving around that baobab tree. As we got closer to it, there were 3 tours going round and round this baobab tree, trying to evade the alouette. And they were so engrossed in trying to evade the alouette, we went right up to them and captured all 3 of them. And these poor kids, I mean, you think they were 2, they were like 19 years old. They looked like they hadn't eaten in a month, but it was so funny to watch these poor guys who are obviously so badly trained, thinking that the biggest thing in the world was watching the alouettes and forgetting that there might be some troops on the bar.
Shameful bears. Yeah.
Yeah, that 42 days out of 42 days was after coming back from Special Forces. I spent a little bit of time with Colonel McVeigh in Special Forces, and you would have remembered that we had the sort of internal Rhodesian settlement, sort of March, April 78.
Yeah.
And we started to have some of these guys that were considered governing Sitoli and Able Muzarewa combatants. And I spent 3 months actually training them with some special branch guys. That was very, very interesting for just that sort of particular period, and seeing how badly these guys really were trained. But it was fascinating to go up there. And I was posted up to KG6 to Georgia 6 barracks. And I never forget going to the quartermaster and he said, "Oh, you're with Special Forces. Come in here." And I look up and I just see all these civilian clothes, and he says, "Pick what you like, because now you're a civvy and you're all dressed in civilian clothes." And I think some of those civilian clothes I've still got. There were so many of them they gave me. So going back to...
Sorry, Vince, yeah. I'm just trying to understand what that a little bit more. Was that Fuma Rivanu?
Well, they called it Fuma Rivanu later in the war, but this was, I mean, Colonel McVeigh was promoted to full colonel and made commander of Special Forces in May 1978. And I think that was the sort of spark of trying to put this Fuma Rivanu together. Later on, it became Fuma Rivanu. They didn't call it that when I joined Headquarters Special Forces. It was such a small unit, Tony. I mean, it was Colonel McVeigh. We had 6 or 7 or 8 special branch people, myself, Trevor Desfountain, and a couple of others. And a few of us were basically designated to go and train them out in the bush, and then put them back into the bush as tours in sort of May, June, July, November 78. I only spent 3 months with them before Colonel McVeigh got promoted to brigadier, and then I went back to RAR. But it was a very interesting time. You'll see that Scorpion badge. That was the badge that we wore on our greens as Special Forces.
It must have been a risky political decision to get Sitoli and the other guys' forces out in the bush, because really, if that agreement had fallen apart, we would have trained our enemy.
I think that's what happened in some of the cases, Tony. In fact, it was dangerous just all along. I almost got killed. You're trying to teach these guys basics of, they trained me in how to strip SKSs and RPGs and AKs and so on. And I can remember trying to do the same to them. And one clever little fellow left a round up the breach and managed to shoot it off in between my legs. So it almost killed me. So sometimes I don't have great recollections of that particular time.
Are you able to share the names of some of the SB guys? Was Winston Hart there or anybody else?
I never saw Winston Hart at some of the briefings that I was at. So I can't remember, to be honest.
No problem. And then you went back to your unit, and is that when that long period of action happened to you?
Yes. So the war was starting to heat up in sort of March, April 79, really quite heavily. And so we just couldn't afford to put companies in fire force. So we came up with this brilliant concept of combined fire forces. So you'd essentially take 1 platoon out of each company, amalgamate them, and put 1 officer in with them, and then the KCOR commander. In those days, my 2 KCOR commanders were Colonel Terry Hammond. He was there with one other lad. And unfortunately, as a young officer, I was there for 6 weeks, 42 days, and I was in contact for 42 out of the 42 days. So either I was in Stock 1 or I was out of the Dakota. And you could sense that when the casualties started to mount. The funny thing was we would have, we go into a contact, for example, we'd have a morning and an afternoon contact. But some of the guys that were killed, we'd be coming back from the conflict, flying out. I remember one flying back to Port Victoria, and we just got sprayed on the ground. We didn't even know where they were there. And one of them happened to hit the second helicopter. I was in the lead helicopter, and it hit my Corporal Moya, who was from Mecca, and shattered his femoral artery. And the South African pilot was flying the plane. There was so much blood spattered in the front of the cockpit that he just couldn't see where he was going. He tried to navigate himself back to Port Victoria, but by the time he got back there, Corporal Moya was dead. And next to me in another contact, my MAG gunner, went down. He also got hit in the femoral artery. So he started the casualty started to mount. And, sometimes I think, but for the grace of God, I can recall in one contact, quite late in the afternoon, just before pickup, where I actually thought one of the other six was coming over the top of a little hill. I got the turf from maybe 2 meters away from me, fired off his AK and missed me. And it's the first time I ever drank brandy in the evening, but just for the grace of God, I could see the flash and just happened to miss me.
That's quite incredible. Can you remember some of the more successful contacts that you had? Could you talk us through the details of maybe one or two, how it all came together?
Well, sure. I think there was one of that particular fire force, Tony, that April fire force down in Rhodesia was the highest kill rate that we had in RAR at that particular period. It skyrocketed maybe a couple of months later, but we killed 46 tours and captured 6. And I can remember a Friday, I'll never forget a Friday, I think just about lunchtime, we were pulled out for our first contact, landing on the ground. I think we had this 3 Alouettes and a good DAC on the ground. And as we got on the ground, I've never seen so many tours running left and right, just trying to get out of the way. And in that particular contact that morning, we killed 10 tours, and I think we captured 1. And we went back to Rhodesia in the afternoon. We were pulled out again, and we had another successful 6 or 7 tours killed. And pretty much it was almost in the same TTLs, very, very close to each other. But the one thing I remember the most about it was the pandemonium of the contact, not from my troops, but just looking up and seeing these tours running like there was no tomorrow, as if we'd surprised them so badly that they didn't know which way to run. And our KPAR commanders were so good that we had troops on the ground in the right river lines and in the right stop gaps that took them up, I think, reasonably easily. So, but for me, I started, 42 days out of 42 days in contact, but towards the end of it, you get to a stage where you just become like an absolute robot. And I can remember Colonel Hammond saying at one point he was close to calling the brigadier to see if he could stop the fire force, which was just getting so brutal. I mean, we had morning and night, morning and afternoon contacts, and it just went on and on. So, and it was okay for our soldiers, because I could rotate the soldiers for a day or 2 break, because we had 4 or 5 platoons. But for me, there was no break, just given the fact that I was the only officer on the ground. So I found that quite something. And to top it all, towards the end of it, I think I was flying with Rich Skinner, and they got us late at night, late in the afternoon, I should say, pick up. And we couldn't see the lights of Fort Victoria. So Rich and I think he's on the KPAR. It was Brian McDermott was KPAR commander, and I think Chaz Goatley, I think, was in the KPAR. Said, right, we'll pick up the lights of Salisbury, and we'll head off towards Salisbury for the night. Fantastic. This is great. And so now it's got really dark, and I can see the lights of Salisbury coming in. The next thing, I just see this tracer coming at us, and it's bending all over the place. And your sort of natural reaction is to tuck your feet underneath you and just hope for the best. But I tell you, that's when you know that rounds really do bend. So we had red and green tracer come up at us for a couple of seconds, and then we landed at Newsay, no problem. But that was quite something.
I'm surprised they fired red tracer, because generally it was green chloride in it. Yeah.
I was surprised to even see the tracer coming towards us. I thought, what the hell are these guys doing?
Yeah, because the bigger caliber was white, but that should have been red. Interesting. That I mean green. Um, what Vince? What did that do to your psychology going through 40 days of that? How did, let's say you had a contact in the morning, okay, you came back, all your bones were in place and you could see out your eyeballs. What did that, how did you come down from that until the call out in the afternoon? Did you go running? Did you have a swim? Did you, I mean, what did you do? Did you just talk to the guys, have a laugh? What did you do in between?
Tony, I generally try to get a little bit of a rest because I just knew that coming was an afternoon contact. It just got so bad. You know, you debrief. I try and lie on my little stretcher and just try and take an hour out. But I think for me, Tony, I think what started to happen, I'm not so sure many of us didn't suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome. I certainly did. So basically what would happen to me is I became very insular. So I wouldn't even go, if I came back on R&R, I wouldn't even leave the mess. So I would spend 10 days out of 10 days in the Fort Vic officers' mess getting drunk, morning, noon, and night, and not even bothering to go back to Salisbury or anywhere. And I think that, later on in life, that got worse. The sort of drinking got worse. And I think that's how we coped. And I firmly believe that many of us still suffer in some way or another from a bit of post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it's just the way that we cope. I don't know if it was different from the RLI guys, but for the RAR guys, remembering that, as white officers, there were very few of us around, and particularly on the combined fire forces, when you were the only officer on the ground, I think one tended to try and cope internally.
Yeah, I want to encourage you to watch episode 119, which is Barry Zoretin talks on PTSD. He's become a little bit of an expert on it in America and other places. And yeah, I mean, I saw so little action in the army, but I experienced enough landmines and being watered and all that sort of stuff that after the war, I found that just sitting in a restaurant, if I didn't have my back to the wall, it was even mentioned in Barry's talk. I think that you want to have your back to the wall. You've got all sorts of psychological things going on, and that was from somebody who saw very little action. It must be very powerful for you to have experienced that.
Well, certainly some of my friends who were commissioned with me, I think, experienced the same, Tony. And I think if I after leaving the army, one of the things that immediately I sensed was the fact that, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times, because we had so much power and so much authority as a young officer. I mean, suddenly you were out the army, you were a civvy again, and it was quite difficult to actually try to come to grips with that. I think many of us for many years struggled to try and find our way in civvy world. But I would never give up. The one thing that the army taught me was a great thing about leadership and about looking after other people. I think that is something that's helped me throughout my late on career as a civvy. Because I think a lot of cities who just don't have that, the feeling of, I think today's world, people are in the management for how quickly can I get to the top. Whereas I think many Rhodesians were in it to how best can I look after my
Yeah, many guys that I've interviewed have spoken to me off camera and said, that they'd become a Christian in the interim, and they found that once they were forgiven, it took 1,000 tons off their shoulders.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's certainly, like I said, I didn't have massive tons of PTSD, but I found relief in coming to know the Lord.
For sure, that's the same thing. I came to know the Lord and gave up drinking 20 years ago, which saved me. I think that was something that saved me, because I was on the slippery slope to going out the door.
That's amazing. You get the 10 steps to alcoholism and all that sort of stuff, but when you surrender to Christ, he can heal you instantly overnight. And I was becoming a drinker, and he heals you. That sense of, I'm forgiven. I don't have to take this to my grave.
Very much so. I think something very, very, what would I like to say? Somebody who had a lot of great insights with me. The one day I'll never forget. I think it was one of our first meetings at Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was blaming the world for everything. And he said to me, "Why don't you just do yourself a favor and look in the mirror, because you are the problem." And I think that was a wonderful thing. And I think that was it. I realized, wait a minute, actually, I'm the problem. If one has a spiritual experience, then you can move on and be
Yeah.
forgiven for many of the things that you've done.
Yeah, yeah. That's you've always got somebody to talk to, and he is alive. I know that for sure after 42 years. Um, Vince, I'm very interested in tactics, so bear with me if I drag you back to that contact where all the tours bombshelled.
Hmm.
Can you give me an aerial view of how that Five Force commander positioned the men? Let's say you got the central point of where the tours were. We're now talking north, west, east, and south.
Yeah.
How did he position you, and what was he looking for to make you the most effective stop groups?
Well, firstly, I think one of the things I wanted to say is that generally the KFAR commanders I thought were, the guys that were in the KFAR were the highest caliber. I never thought once that I ever KFAR commander. I'm not talking about the pilots. Pilots were brilliant as KFAR pilots, but I think our commanders were tactically very superior. Guys like Andre Dennison, Brian McDermott, etc. And I think just given the fact that they'd come through counterinsurgency themselves, gave them a wonderful sense of and their experience of how to position troops to have the maximum kill rate. And I think when you talk about whether it was north, it was west, or south, Tony, I think for me, what I often found as a young second lieutenant was I seemed to be on the ground positioned at the right place at the right time, because they first of all, they could see generally where the gooks were, but they instinctively knew what would happen 20, 30, 40 minutes from where the original contacts were. Where would the gooks bombshell, where would the tours bombshell to? What would be our reaction to those? How do we get them into a situation we can have these maximum kill rates? And I think that's the wonderful tactics of what they have, what they have, and just their ability to also, I think, be flexible. If something happened, like if you took a casualty, or something, happened, like there was a stoppage with the 20 mil, or one of the G class put you down and couldn't get up. It never phased them. There was always a second and third and fourth plan. And for me, that's what gave me confidence in my commanders, was the fact that I knew they had my back, and I knew that I was going to get on the ground and be of maximum effectiveness.
So they could see the terrain, the topography from the aircraft, of course. So they would say, right, target there, 20 mil cannons will start on that. They're going to flee over there because it's thick bush, it's a river line, blah, 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 blah. And that's more or less where they would start dropping the stop groups to smack them there.
Well, yeah, that sounds good in theory. Sometimes you'd be surprised at what tours do when they're under pressure. Sometimes they don't run into river lines. Sometimes they run straight into open fields. You'd be surprised at what they do. And I think that's where I'm talking about the flexibility of some of our commanders, is that they had that in the back of their mind. I know it's the easy thing to say, oh, they'll get into the river line and disappear. When you're under tons of pressure, and some of those tours were not well trained, they'll do some amazing stuff. Like I said, go around baobab trees, hide behind antlers, and those sorts of things. So I think that was the flexibility of our commanders, and making sure that they understood, I think, the whole of the operation, rather than just be a sort of a rule of thumb.
Let's say a group of 50, 20 ran that way, 10 ran that way. Are individual choppers allowed to break rank and chase the 20 and the other guys go, or is that too difficult to manage?
No, I never experienced that. I mean, the KFAR pilot was always in command of his helicopters and making sure that where they positioned the troops. It would have got way out of hand, Tony, if it had been a situation where people were allowed to do their own things. I think I certainly always found it well coordinated, and and as I say, towards the end of our Rhodesian pilots were brilliant, but we had a lot of South African pilots come up. I talk a little bit about going down to train them in South Africa, just now myself and Hammond and but when the South African pilots came up as well, they were also fantastic, and really were just as aggressive as our guys were. But I always found everything to be very well coordinated with the G-pilot.
Is there anything more you'd like to say about being in the RAR before we move on to your experience going to South Africa to train the guys there?
No, I just think, just summing up, I think RAR, I think you said it best, but it is a wonderful thing to say that I think our RAR troops were some of the most aggressive, some of the most fearless, and some of the most loyal that we could serve with. And I couldn't have served in a better battalion than PRR. It was a great feeling.
Vince, I believe you went on a 106 course, anti-tank. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure, Tony. Yeah, that was a great course down at the School of Infantry. It was 10th of September 79 to 26th October 79, right towards the end of the war. The South Africans have started to bring up for us the 106 reportless rifles. They were very popular during the Vietnam War, as you would have known. I think it was a wonderful weapon. Yeah, it had a 50 millimeter spotter gun at the top, which you fire towards the tank. Once you zeroed in on the tank, you then let off the 106 round. It was a hell of a powerful recoilless rifle. It was accurate to about 1,800 meters, but in the theoretical handbooks it said you could shoot it up to 7.7 kilometers. There was no chance of that, but it was a wonderful course down at regimental wing, and towards the end of the war, or I should say at the end of the war, when we were considering having that lovely attacks against the assembly points, I was briefed to be able to take on an assembly point with the 106s, which never happened. But I believe the South Africans, we had the high explosive anti-tank rounds for those rifles, but they brought up the high explosive Scotch head, the H round, and the high explosive anti-personnel rounds, which we were going to use against the APs, which never happened. But it was a great course. I think I got the top student for that course. It was a really powerful course. But the funny thing was, as soon as independence came, Tony, those 106s disappeared back to South Africa quicker than you could say anything. But one of the guys you might know from the course was Bill Wiggle. Bill was actually my instructor on that course. Probably one of the most brilliant instructors I had ever had. And he made it a thoroughly enjoyable course. Rich Cook from 1RR was also on the course with me, and there were a number of other guys, other battalions, but a fantastically well-run course by regiment.
It was a lovely weapon to fire. You set at right angles, pushed a lever, and then pulled a lever and pushed a lever. One of them sent off that sighting round. I believe the Israelis were so good at hitting the Arab tanks that when the Arabs heard that bing from the 50 mil round, they were out.
Oh yeah,
and running.
And we had to be just as accurate, Tony, because there wasn't thousands of rounds the Rhodesians had. So you had to be pretty good with getting the 50 mil sighter round going. And in fact, when we had our final exercise in this, I don't think we had more than 2 or 3 rounds each to let off. So you had to be pretty accurate. But it was wonderful.
And the casing made a wonderful lampstand, eh?
They did indeed.
They were really prized.
They were.
I
gave mine away. I don't have any left.
Oh dear. Yeah, talking about those rounds that you mentioned, for those who are not technical militarily, a heat round hits armor and it bores a hole through. It's like a teardrop. I actually picked up one of the teardrops and had it for years and then lost it. That cuts through. Then a Hesh round is high explosive Scotch head. It comes against the outside, sends a shockwave through, which peels off armor on the inside, and that whizzes around. And then, of course, the anti-personnel one. I think that was like ball bearings or something in there.
It was ball bearings. Very nice.
Yeah.
And again, used successfully in the Vietnam War. That's what it was. And in fact, the French had it, going all the way back to 1954. They also used it there. Yeah, it was a very, very, very powerful weapon. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yes. And, the Frelimo had T-34s. I think they had a few T-55s, perhaps. But a 106 would have gone right through those, like, no problem.
No water through butter. No problem at all. No, it would have been straight through, yeah. I think some of our fantastic engineers and guys captured a couple of T-55s and brought them back to Rhodesia as well.
Yeah, gee, we got a few off a ship as well. I think that sort of brings us to the end of your RAR time, and then you were seconded to South African units to train them in fire force procedures, were you?
Yeah, well, I was still with True RAR. So just after the anti-tank didn't come on the school, so I got a call from Colonel Hammond to come back to battalion headquarters. And myself, Lou Hallimore, I don't know if you would have known him, RSM Lou Hallimore, myself went down to South Africa to just south of Messina in the Ciskei to go and train up 3 South African Infantry Battalion, and bring them back up to Tenga. And a wonderful story. I'll tell you a little bit about that training in a minute. But a wonderful story was, I can remember the Sunday getting on the chopper with Lou Hallamore, myself, and Terry Hammond, and off we trekked off down to Messina. Just as we crossed the Limpopo, I don't know what the pilot did, but old Lou Hallamore had his beautiful pace stick with it, sitting on his knees. I don't know what the hell he brought it with. And the pilot did this sharp right-hand turn, and out went the pace stick out of the door. And I'd always thought nothing would go out the door. We thought, oh, the centrifugal force. And I tell you, I've never seen an RSM so pissed off and so surprised. Me and Terry Hammond had to hold in the laughter. It was funny. Of course, we could never find the pace stick. But I don't think Lou Hallamore was the most chuffed RSM I'd ever.
Yeah, I bet the pilot did that deliberately just to get it out the door.
It's probably. Yes, so we arrived and down to the camp in Ciskei, and started to train up. Colonel Hammond trained a couple of the majors in Cape operations. I took troops on the ground for normal fire force operations out of the Alouettes. And the interesting thing about that, and of course, Lou Hallamore was there with the troops. The wonderful thing about that, or most interesting thing about that, was it was interesting to note that it seemed like the South African Air Force and the South African Army were not that as cohesive as we were. And certainly in the evening, as we found ourselves sitting in Puma drinking beers with the South African Air Force, and they seemed to keep a little bit away from the Army guys. But it was a wonderful experience down there, and we brought up a squadron of Pumas up to Rutenga and bust up the whole of 3 SAI. So suddenly, you could put 80 troops on the ground, Tony, rather than 12 troops and 3 Alouettes and 16 guys in their deck. There were 80 troops on the ground with all of the Pumas, and the kill rates went through the roof from November, December 79. It was frightening. I found the troopies, the 3 SAI troopies, just exceptionally aggressive.
Yeah.
The young officers, they were national servicemen. They really struggled. But the troopie and the sort of other ranks, corporals and stuff, highly aggressive, wonderful to work with, and just gung-ho.
Really, infantry war is the corporal and sergeant war, really, isn't it? It's those guys.
Yeah, it really is. That was certainly quite something. And one of the other things that was interesting is, remember the guy saying, we need all your Rhodesian dollars you can give us. We'll give you South African rand. And it was, I think to myself, I wish I had a whole lot of South African Rhodesian dollars down to exchange. I think I had like $5 on me. In those days, South African rands were gold. But anyway, I had a great time. Certainly found the South African pilots as well were top one.
Now, deploying in a 4-man Alouette versus 15, 16 and in a Puma, how did that change the dynamics of Fire Force? Because you suddenly got 16 men, whereas you could maybe put 4 over there. But how did you, not being familiar with Pumas, suddenly adapt to having to do it with Pumas?
You had to just, the thing is, remember being down in South Africa for that week also helped me as well, because we were using the Pumas there. So for me, it was a little bit less of a problem. You just had to adapt, Tony. The great thing was, of course, you needed slightly bigger LZs, the landing zones, to put them down. But the great thing was that, you still had the KFAR commanders directing operations, and you could put so many troops on the ground that, you could, instead of filling up 2 or 3 river lines, you could fill up 6 or 7 or 8 river lines. So as I said earlier, the kill rate started to become quite exponential. So it was a wonderful thing. But also, you would have remembered in the Puma, it's not like the Alouette. In the Alouette, you could get out quite quickly with the doors open in the Puma. It took a little bit of time to get 16 guys out of there. But still, once you were on the ground, it was wonderful to have so many troops available to go on operations.
One guy I interviewed, or I think it was earlier on in the series, he was a Parabat, and they really complimented the RAR on their aggressiveness, and they themselves were very aggressive, and the RAR thought, wow, these guys are giants, but they were very impressed with the RAR. And I think at that stage of the war, some of the RAR sweep lines were like 16 MAGs out of 18 guys or something. It was,
And the thing is, Tony, by then, towards the end of the war, imagine you think of the RAR experience, how much experience those soldiers have, and they were regular soldiers, many of them. So they were battle hardened. They really were battle hardened, and some of them got the top awards. There were many SCRs and PCRs issued to the RAR troops. So a
very
wonderful
well,
fighting force.
very well deserved. So I think this sort of concludes the Rhodesian story, if that's all right with you, Vince.
Sure.
Obviously, when the war ended, which was a shock to all of us, the way it ended and all that sort of stuff, you decided to stay on and you went into the Zimbabwean army. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, for sure. So towards the end of December 1980, I attended Combat Team Commander's Force, which was then the School of Infantry had been changed to Zimbabwe Military Academy. In fact, before that, I actually was a course officer when Zipper and Zanya were being amalgamated into the army. I ran one of the first courses, bringing these guys. There were only 4 courses training. We were bringing them from second lieutenant to battalion to IC in 4 weeks. It's actually quite frightening. But I also had the opportunity to do the Combat Team Commander's course. In fact, Brigadier Pat Lewis was the course officer for that course, and Leon Creel was OC tactics. On that course, for like Andy Telfer, Pocky Binks, Graham Swart, myself, and then we had Zipper and Zanda commanders on that course. So that was a 6-week course. None of the Zipper or Zanda guys actually passed the course. It was just, I wouldn't be surprised because they just didn't have the background to it. And then I was chosen to go to the UK and do the British Combat Team Commander's course at the School of Infantry in Warminster, January 1981. And that was quite something to get across there. I mean, our commandant at the School of Infantry was a lieutenant colonel. When I arrived there and I saw the size of the School of Infantry in Warminster, and it was commanded by a lieutenant major general. But the funny thing was, Tony, is that many of the guys, and I'm sure you'll show the photograph, that I attended the Combat Team Commanders course were probably 10 years senior to me, 10 years older than in the British Army. They were fairly senior majors by the time they hit the Company Commanders course and the Combat Team Commanders course. And very few of them had any formal training, operational training. So I found it, and very conventionally focused. So I found it quite strange. I was a little bit frustrated in a number of cases, just being there. But there were 1 or 2 officers who I really got on with. The para guys, the guys on the parachute battalion, a guy called Major Dave McCabe, who was 2IC at the paras. He was on my force. We hit it off very well. And then the guy who commanded, Pat Lewis, probably know him, Arthur Denoria, became a brigadier. He commanded the tank regiments during the Iraqi war. He was a really good guy. But I just found a lot of the officers to be, they were more formal and sort of more peacetime than they were army folks. So anyway, I did the 6 weeks of that, and then straight after that, the good news was I then went and helped train the young platoon commanders who had come out of Sandhurst 18 months earlier and were doing their platoon commanders courses, and trained them in platoon commander, which was really excellent. But again, some of the units that I got on well with, others were pretty much peacetime soldiers, I thought.
And you were still attached to the Zimbabwe army at this point?
Yeah, I was still in the army, in the Zimbabwe army. So they sent me across to go and do that.
Those senior majors, because we were Rhodesian and we'd fought against or bucked the crown and all that sort of stuff, did they look at you with a bit of distaste? What's this on the end of my nose? Did you get that feeling?
With some of them, and in fact, I'm glad you said that, because actually, I'll never forget the sort of final orders group that I ever got in the army, in the Rhodesian army before independence. We got the orders dropped out of us we were in Zaka, dropped out by an airplane. When I opened the orders papers, it said situation enemy forces, Commonwealth Monitoring Force. And I thought, geez, we're fighting our own kith and kin. So, I think some of them did look down at us, and I think they thought they'd done a jolly good job convincing us that Mugabe was a great savior for the country, and maybe we were wrong. I used to try and remind them that the Rhodesians had fought in two wars for them and had sacrificed their lives, during those times. But there were others who were very loyal to the Rhodesian cause and great supporters of it. So you had it on both sides. And the thing is, Tony, they had their own particular problems. If you recall, the Northern Ireland um, and IRA thing was a big deal in those days. And there were some officers that were serving in the Irish battalions that weren't able even to tell their parents they were actually in the army, and kept it very quiet. So they had their own problems as well. So it wasn't all lily white.
Yeah, I'm sure they must have appreciated your experience in that platoon commander's course, because what better than from the mouth of a man that's experienced it all.
Yeah, I certainly enjoyed it. I lost my sense of humor the one night when my little group got us lost in the middle of Salisbury Plains in the middle of winter. That wasn't the greatest of fun. I expected them to be able to get better than that, but it's amazing how young officers, even with the compasses, can get themselves so badly lost.
Well, I live just below Salisbury Plains. I hear artillery practicing here just about twice a month. And although you're in England, you'd think you can't get lost. You just have to walk 5 miles and there's another Kentucky Fried, but you can get horribly lost here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And Tony, I must say, one of the things that was something for me was during that combat team commander course, was the first time I ever saw an 810 tank buster. And I just couldn't believe the power of those. I was thinking, I wish we had some of those in the Rhodesian days. Those would be great.
That's a Gatling gun with a plane strapped to its back, eh?
That's it. That's very
Yeah,
nice.
uranium depleted rounds. Fantastic thing.
Yeah. So after that, I then I was very enthusiastic. I thought the army was still going to be great. So I came back, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed into the school of Zimbabwean Military Academy, and my ex company commander Brian McDermott had just been promoted to commandant as colonel, and he appointed me as officer cadet in charge of officer cadet wing. And one of my tasks was to shorten the officers' course, the 13-month course, to 8 months, because obviously the new National Army wanted to get their officers out the door quickly. But it wasn't soon thereafter, Tony, maybe 3 or 4 months, that all of a sudden we had a Zanla colonel come in. His name was Gibson Mashindaidze. Pulled us all into the mess and said, "I am your new boss. I am your new god. And you'll do what I tell you to do." I think that was about November 81, and that was pretty much all the mass resignations from the Zimbabwe Military Academy came about, and then all of our photographs of the mess were taken down. Just over to do stupid things. So I left pretty much thereafter, after having a fairly bad altercation with the Zipper commander and the officers and stuff. That was time for me to pack up.
I read what you said in your synopsis. I'm quite happy for you to tell us what you did in there, but quite profound way of talking to one of those guys.
Yeah, it wasn't the best. I had quite a few to drink, and I had my 9mm in my hand, or in my holster in the mess, and it started to irritate me a little bit about the Rhodesian army. So, to cut a long story short, it was a little bit of an altercation, and he wasn't the colonel anymore. And, because I think it was time for me to move on. Monday morning, I was in front of a black brigadier, and where they all threatened to court martial me because I wanted to shoot him. What it's time to do.
Unbelievable. Were you involved in the scene in Bulawayo in Tumbani 1 and 2? No,
I wasn't. I was actually at the School of Infantry in Warminster, in England, when that happened.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sitting over there.
Yeah,
and very soon after that, I think it wasn't that. Now I came back May 81. Then the Falklands War started in June 82. In fact, I was asked whether I wanted to join the British Army, and it just wasn't something I was keen to do. That was the last of my army service, which I left the Zimbabwe Army on 31st of January 82.
We're going to sort of end now, Vince. Just very briefly, give us an overview of what you did from when you left the army until today. Just a very brief 5-minute talk.
Well, when I left the army, I think I said to you that I pretty much didn't know what to do. I actually came down to South Africa and joined Checkers as a training manager. I mean, that was, you can imagine, from being a captain in the army to being a training manager was quite something.
Oh, yeah.
And then I sort of bumbled around for a couple of more years. I went into a company called ep341, and then started to, it was then I started to learn a little bit about materials management. Uh, Cut a long story short, I went into the DBS group, and I worked my way up there, and they sent me actually off to university. I went to university in 1989 on a free scholarship actually, to go and do finance and materials management at the University of McCabe, and then followed that up with a honors degree in business. And I did my MBA, I can talk about MBA at the government in McCabe.
Oh, that got lost in a glitch there. You went and you did finance, and what happened after that?
Finance and materials management at the University of McCabe.
Materials, okay.
And then I did my honors degree at Rhodesia, and then I did my MBA, my Masters of Business Administration in Durham, in the UK, in finance, operations management, and strategy. And yeah, I stayed in procurement, and then I went into the consulting field and spent some time in mining throughout most of the world. I think I've worked in all 5 continents. I just recently retired, so. But after giving up the drinking, I think that's when my career took off again. I managed to find, I think that was when the academics really paid off, because it's all very well having academics, but when you're drinking yourself to a standstill, it's all not.
I once heard that a full major, even a major, which is still a field rank, could become the CEO of a company, because there's just something in the army training that can be used laterally, even in economics or business. Obviously, you might need some technical training, but that very the nature of what the army's told you, how to delegate, how to plan, how blah blah blah. Did you find your army had a bearing on your civilian work?
Oh, absolutely. I think I said that to you earlier. That was what, I got to some very senior positions. I was a senior director in one of the mining companies in the supply chain, and I always felt that the army experience of being an officer and that leadership held me in great stead. And it was I think the ability to have people's interests at heart is something that a lot of, I just think if you don't have that military experience, that you lack. One of the things I loved about, and I spent some time in America in a mining company. One of the things I loved about the Americans is that they tried so hard to try and make sure that their military people, that somehow they could equate their military experience to their civilian experience. We never found that in Rhodesia, which was a real pity. But if you look at how many of our Rhodesians who've been in the army and have had senior positions, I think it's come through that leadership and being having, whether it be as a corporal or a sergeant or a W2 or a major or a colonel, many of them could get to the top. I think that was all about the leadership that was given to us through the army training.
Yeah, something ingrained in us. Vince, you've written a book which took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears out of you. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I tell you, not me, the whole of our officer cadet course put the book together. It's called The Making of Rhodesian Army Officers. And it was a concept that I sort of had in my brain for many, many a year about, could we tell the story of the 54 regular cadet corps? It's a different way of looking at things. I think if you ask people about what's your army experience, you've been in the regular army as an officer, you get 18 different experiences. So I sort of thought, I wonder if it's possible to put together this book where we have all the guys who were on the course tell their first-hand experiences of what it was like to go through those 54 weeks, and to try and put it together with the course officer who led the course and the course instructor. The challenge with that, eventually, I think myself and Graham Trask were talking about it sort of 2010. I spent a couple of years in the UN as a diplomat as well. And I sort of said to Graham, I think it's time we should try and put this book together. What do you think? And the problem was that the Rhodesians had scattered to the 4 winds. So we had, all the cadets who were still alive were in 5 different continents. The UK, Europe, I was in Denmark. Some people were in Zimbabwe. Some guys were in South Africa. And it was quite hard work to try and get everyone together again. And it took some time to do that. So, and the concept was to try and put the book together, first of all, talking about life before cadet corps, to make sure we tried to get everybody's stories, and that included the officer cadets who either were killed in action or who are dead, we contacted their families and got their life before cadet course when we could. And some of us who were on the course actually wrote pieces about them as part of the book. And then to go through each cadet's experience of the 54 weeks. And we were very fortunate. Terence Hewitt, who got commissioned with me to do RAR, he took photographs throughout the 54 weeks. So when you look at this book, you're going to see 355 pages of work and over 100 photographs that have never been seen before. I did the first sort of reviews, sort of the first draft, and then far from it thereafter, Rene Rectin, who went to School of Signals, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to capture his story. He's got some fascinating technical stuff that they were doing back in the war that we wouldn't believe that some of those guys would come up with. But he did the second review of the book and did a fantastic job of that. And then the third and final review was done by Ian McLaughlin, who went to services corps, him and his wife Marion, and spent a lot of time putting this together. And the concept is this wonderful book, which shows everybody's experiences. And I didn't realize we had such some of the guys who put the stories together have got such stories to tell. And you see these things, I think you said earlier, Tony, you see these things you might think that you've got all the perspective, but you'd be surprised at what each individual officer cadet's perspective was of those 54 weeks. But we all lived in this terrible terror of being kicked off the course. Right until the last couple of weeks, there was nobody that thought they were safe in this. But a wonderful experience. And to have Ian Smith, the Prime Minister, he was the reviewing officer for our cadet course, was something fantastic. And I think if I look at the sort of end of the course, I want to just say, a couple of things. Mike Wilson, who was the course officer, his final synopsis, and I'll read it. It says, any young officer who completed a regular cadet course at the School of Infantry in Grello could be justifiably proud of what they had achieved. The syllabus used to evaluate and train these cadets has been tried and tested over a number of years, and this, coupled with the caliber of instructors, produced officers who could compete in any arena and win. It was a privilege to be involved with all the exceptional men of Infantry 2520, which was the cadet course that we were commissioned on. And, for those guys who do want to go and buy, there's three different types of book. There's the hard copy, the soft copy, and the Kindle. And there's some wonderful Amazon reviews. And I think just to finish off, I wanted to just read one of the Amazon reviews, which I thought was a wonderful review. I don't know who wrote it, but it says, the raw, authentic voices of these young men are so compelling. As they learn their warcraft and the course progresses, they gain insights into themselves and reveal these too, gaining in self-confidence and starting to enjoy the process of making them into officers. The many original photographs taken by one of the cadets supports their stories and gives an excellent perspective of the events described. This book is a great reflection on a time that imprinted so much into their psyche and built their individual characters, as well as being a time capsule of this aspect of the history of Zimbabwe Rhodesia. And I think that's a wonderful Amazon review. So I hope people would enjoy buying it. It's got wonderful photos. I think hats off to all of the officer cadets who put their stories together, from the guy sitting in Australia, guys like PJ Holmes, Bobby Graves, got the sword, Rene Rectin, Ian McLaughlin, to our guys sitting in Botswana, Pete Taylor, the Zimbabwe guys, the late Charlie Davies, Terence Hewitt, the South African guys, Graham Swart, Hamish McIntyre, and of course our wonderful man who's sitting in the USA, Rich Cook. Everyone contributed to it, and all of those fallen cadets. And we've dedicated the book to those who served the Rhodesia, Tony. So I think it's a good read.
That's fantastic. Available on Amazon.
Yep.
And wow, that type of story would be very interesting to somebody who's training soldiers from a psychological point of view. If they read that book, they could start understanding the psychology of men and put it into their training.
I think that's right, Tony. I'm hoping that also armed forces throughout the world will buy the book, because I think it has, for those guys that are in Sandhurst, the guys that are in Israel, or the guys that are in America and those sorts of places, I think it's a wonderful understanding of that time of the war years. There was no time for messing around. You weren't getting commissioned and going to peacetime. You were going directly into war. And I think that in the back of the mind of the course officer and the army commander at the time was, can you bring a leader through in 13 months and put him in front into war? And that's a big difference. So I'm hoping that, we'll go into the libraries of all of these other places as well.
Wonderful. Well, Vince, thank you very much for a very interesting and inspiring talk. And I'd like to encourage other guys to come forward and give their talks, as Vince has mentioned. And don't think that because, I saw Joe Blogg's talk on what I would possibly be talking about, therefore I'm not going to do it. As Vince has said, everybody's attitude on the same course can be so diverse, not just on courses, but out in contexts wherever they happened, various battles that took place in the army. So please do come forward and share your history with us. That's what this is all about. And I'd like to thank John Fonsale, who spends a lot of time behind the cameras, behind the scenes, editing these series. And so thank you, John. And right, thanks very much, Vince, and all the best to you in Ireland, and hope you have a lovely retirement.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Tony, for everything you do, and Johnny. God bless.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.